All right, so in this lecture, we're going to cover Section 3 and Section 4, and we're going to start here with the decline of Northern slavery and the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. So slave labor had really helped fuel the market revolution. By 1832, textile companies made up 88 of 106 American corporations, valued at over $100,000. These textile mills, worked by free labor, nevertheless depended on Southern cotton and vast new market economies spurred by the expansion of the plantation South. By the early 19th century, states north of the Mason-Dixon line had taken steps to abolish slavery. Vermont included abolition as part of a provision in 1777 state constitution. Pennsylvania's Emancipation Act of 1780 stipulated that freed children must serve an indentured term of 28 years. Gradualism brought emancipation while also defending the interests of Northern masters and controlling still another generation of black Americans. In 1804, New Jersey became the last of the northern states to adopt gradual emancipation plans. There was no immediate moments of jubilee, though, as many northern states only promised to liberate future children born to enslaved mothers, which you need to know for quiz and test purposes. Such laws also stipulated that children remain in indentured servitude to their mother's master in order to compensate for the slaveholder's loss. James Mars, a young man indentured under this system in Connecticut, risked being thrown in jail when he protested the arrangement that kept him bound to his mother's master until the age of 25. Quicker routes to freedom included escape or direct emancipation by masters, but escape was dangerous and voluntary manumissions were rare. Congress, for instance, made harboring a fugitive slave a federal crime as early as 1793. Hopes for manumission were even slimmer, as few northern slaveholders emancipated their own slaves. Roughly one-fifth of white families in New York City owned slaves, and fewer than 80 slaveholders in the city voluntarily manumitted slaves between 1783 and 1800. By 1830, census data suggests that there were at least 3,500 people still enslaved in the North. Elderly Connecticut slaves remained in bondage as late as 1848, and for quiz purposes, you need to understand this. New Jersey slavery endured until after the Civil War. Emancipation proceeded slowly, but proceeded nonetheless. A free black population of fewer than 60,000 in 1790 increased to more than 186,000 by 1810. Growing free black communities fought for civil rights in a number of New England locales. Free African Americans could vote and send their children to public schools. Most northern states granted black citizens property rights and trial by jury. African Americans owned land and businesses, founded mutual aid societies, established churches, promoted education, developed print culture, and voted. Nationally, however, the slave population continued to grow from less than 700,000 in 1790 to more than 1.5 million in 1820. The growth of abolition in the North and the acceleration of slavery in the South really created major divisions. Cotton drives this process more than any other crop, and in fact, for quiz purposes, you need to understand what the number one driving factor was. You could easily argue here that Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which was a simple hand cranking device designed to mechanically remove the sticky green seeds from the cotton, allowed Southern planters to dramatically expand cotton production for the national and international markets. You also have water-powered textile factories in England and the American Northeast rapidly turning raw cotton into cloth. Technology increased both the supply and the demand for cotton. White Southerners responded by expanding cultivation further west, to the Mississippi River and beyond. Slavery had been growing less profitable in tobacco planting regions like Virginia, but the growth of cotton further south and west increased the demand for human bondage. Eager cotton planters invested their new profits in new slaves. The cotton boom fueled speculation in slavery, and many slave owners leveraged potential profits into loans used to purchase ever-increasing number of slaves. For example, one 1840 Louisiana Courier ad warned, "It is very difficult now to find persons willing to buy slaves from Mississippi or Alabama on account of the fears entertained that such property may be already mortgaged to the banks of the above-named states." New national and international markets fueled the plantation boom. American cotton exports rose from 150,000 bales in 1815 to 4.5 million bales in 1859. The Census Bureau's 1860 Census of Manufacturers stated that the manufacture of cotton constitutes the most striking feature of the industrial history of the last 50 years. Slave owners shipped their cotton north to textile manufacturers and northern financiers for overseas shipments. Northern insurance brokers and exporters in the Northeast profited greatly. So while the United States ended its legal participation in the global slave trade in 1808, slave traders moved 1 million slaves from tobacco-producing Upper South to cotton fields in the Lower South between 1790 and 1860. This harrowing trade in human flesh supported middle-class occupations in the North and the South. Bankers, doctors, lawyers, insurance brokers, and shipping agents all profited. And of course, it facilitated the expansion of the northeastern textile mills. That brings us to the end of Section 3. Now, in Section 4, we're going to talk about the changes in labor organization. While industrialization bypassed most of the American South, Southern cotton produced nevertheless nurtured industrialization in the Northeast and Midwest. This drive to produce cloth transformed the American system of labor. In the early republic, laborers in manufacturing might typically have been expected to work at every stage of production. But for quiz purposes, you need to understand there was a new system called piecework, which divided much of the production into discrete steps performed by workers at different spots. In this new system, merchants and investors sent out or put out materials to individuals and families to complete at home. These independent laborers then turned over the partially finished goods to the owner to be given to another laborer to finish. As early as the 1790s, however, merchants in New England began experimenting with machines to replace the putting out system. To effect this transition, merchants and factory owners relied on the theft of British technological knowledge to build the machines they needed. In 1789, for instance, a textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, contracted 21-year-old British immigrant Samuel Slater to build a yarn spinning machine and then a carding machine. Slater had apprenticed in an English mill and succeeded in mimicking the English machinery. The fruits of American industrial espionage really peaked in 1830 when Francis Cabot Lowell and Paul Moody recreated the powered loom used in the mills in Manchester, England. Lowell had spent 2 years in Britain observing and touring mills in England, and he committed the design of the powered loom to memory so that no matter how many times the British customs officials searched his luggage, he could smuggle England's industrial know-how back to New England. Lowell's contribution to the American industrial system was not just technological, it was organizational. He helped organize and centralize the American manufacturing process. A new approach, which was called the Waltham-Lowell system, created the textile mill that defined antebellum New England and American industrialism before the Civil War. The modern American textile mill was fully realized in the planted mill town of Lowell in 1821, 4 years after Lowell himself died. Powered by the Merrimack River in northern Massachusetts and operated by local farm girls, the mills of Lowell centralized the process of textile manufacturing under one roof. The modern American factory was born. Soon 10,000 laborers labored in Lowell alone. Sarah Rice, who worked at a nearby Millbury factory, found it a noisy place that was more confined than I like to be. Working conditions were harsh for many desperate mill girls who operated the factories relentlessly from sunup to sundown. One worker complained that a large class of females are and have been destined to a state of servitude. Females went on strike. They lobbied for better working hours, but the lure of wages was too much. As another worker noted, very many ladies have given up millinery, dressmaking, and schoolkeeping for work in the mill. With a large supply of eager workers, Lowell's vision brought a rush of capital and entrepreneurs to New England, and the first American manufacturing boom was underway. The market revolution shook other industries as well. Craftsmen began to understand that new markets increased the demand for their products. Some shoemakers, for instance, abandoned the traditional method of producing custom-built shoes at their home workshops and instead producing large quantities of shoes in ready-made sizes to be shipped to urban centers. Manufacturers wanted increased production, so they abandoned the old personal approach of relying on single live-in apprentice for labor and instead hired unskilled wage laborers who did not have to be trained in all aspects of making shoes, but could be simply assigned one single repeatable aspect of the task. Factories slowly replaced shops, and the old paternalistic apprentice system, which involved long-term obligations between apprentice and master, gave way to a more impersonal and more flexible labor system in which the unskilled laborers could be hired and fired as the market dictated. Now, for quiz and test purposes, you need to know that from 1826 to 1840, it would have been a rarity to find laborers crafting skills in this old apprenticeship style. And so you have masters turned employees not only having fewer obligations to their workers, but they also had lesser attachment. They no longer shared the bonds of their trade, but were subsumed under new class-based relationships: employers and employees, bosses and workers, capitalists and laborers. On the other hand, workers were freed from their long-term paternalistic obligations of apprenticeship or the legal subjugation of indentured servitude. They could theoretically work when they wanted and where they wanted. When men and women made an agreement with an employer to work for wages, they felt they were left free to apportion among themselves their respective shares, untrampled by unwise laws. But while the new labor system was celebrated throughout the Northeast United States as free labor, it was simultaneously lamented by a growing powerless class of laborers. As the Northern United States rushed headlong towards commercialization and the early capitalist economy, many Americans grew uneasy about the growing gap between wealthy business and impoverished wage laborers. Elites like Daniel Webster might defend their wealth and privilege by insisting that all workers could achieve a career of usefulness in enterprise if they were industrious and sober. But labor activist Seth Luther countered that capitalism and said that it was a cruel system of extraction on the bodies and minds of the producing classes, for no other object than to enable the rich to take care of themselves while the poor must work or starve. Americans embarked on the Industrial Revolution with the expectation that men and women could start their careers as humble wage earners, but later achieve positions of ownership and stability with hard work. Wage work had traditionally been looked down on as a state of dependence, suitable only as a temporary waypoint for young men without resources on their path toward the middle class and economic success necessary to support a wife and children ensconced with the domestic sphere. Children's magazines such as Juvenile Miscellany and Parley's magazines glorified the prospect of moving up the economic ladder. This free labor ideology provided many Northerners with a keen sense of superiority over the slave economy of the Southern states. But the commercial economy often failed in its promise of social mobility. Depressions and downturns might destroy businesses and reduce owners to wage work. Even in times of prosperity, unskilled workers might perpetually lack good wages and economic security and therefore had to forever depend on supplemental income from their wives and young children. Wage workers, a population disproportionately composed of immigrants and poorer Americans, face low wages, long hours, and dangerous conditions. Class conflict develops. Instead of the formal inequity of a master-servant contract, employer-employee entered a contract presumably as equals, but hierarchy was evident. Employers had financial security and political power. Employees faced uncertainty and powerlessness in workplaces. Dependent on the whims of their employers, some workers turned to strikes and unions to pool their resources. In 1825, a group of journeymen in Boston formed a carpenters' union to protest their inability to maintain a family at the present time with the wages which are now usually given. Working men organized into unions to assert themselves and win both the respect and resources due to the breadwinner and a citizen. For middle-class managers and between workers and owners, unions inflamed a dangerous antagonism between employers and employees. They countered any claims of inherent class conflict with the ideology of social mobility. Middle-class owners and managers justified their economic privilege as a natural product of superior character traits, including decision-making and hard work. One group of master carpenters denounced their striking journeymen in 1825 with a claim that workers of industrious and temperate habits have, in their turn, become thriving and respectable masters, and the great body of mechanics that have enabled to acquire property and respectability with just a weight and influence on society. In an 1856 speech in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Abraham Lincoln had to assure his audience that the country's commercial transformation had not reduced American laborers to slavery. Southerners, he said, insist that their slaves are better off than Northern freemen. What a mistaken view do these men have of Northern laborers. They think that men are always to remain laborers here, but there is no such class. The man who labored for another last year, this year's labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. The essential belief undergirded this Northern commitment to free labor and won the market revolution a lot of widespread acceptance. And that brings us to an end of this lecture.